Hi, this is a video on John Stuart Mill's view of utilitarianism. I've asked you to look at chapter 2 of that book, but it's also the way he goes about making decisions on liberty. He makes this quote I've raised before: "I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions." And he's got a rather developed view of utilitarianism, which really fuels the whole reason for On Liberty. Why do we need to develop something like a view about what people should or shouldn't be allowed to do in society and figure out what would be the maximal amount of freedom we could give people? Well, it turns out it's because Mill believes in utilitarianism, and that's going to be the way that we're going to figure out how to live the happiest life. So everybody needs to play, and everybody needs to be given the maximum amount of freedom to do that sort of play. Okay, so let's see how that works out. So let's talk a little bit first about utilitarianism. And there's two general principles of utilitarianism. It's an action for the sake of an end, so the end gives the action its whole character and color. So it's good if it produces good effects, it's bad if it produces bad effects. And it's a one principle theory, so it's the greatest happiness principle, what it's called. And again, we've seen that quote before: actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Okay, by happiness, Mill means pleasure in the absence of pain. Okay, but Mill does not advocate what you might call a crass hedonism. He doesn't want everybody just going around, at least he says this, fulfilling every desire that hits their head. Okay, he believes that some pleasures are qualitatively better, and those are ones that human beings actually want. Now, this is going to get him into a little bit of a bind. How does he figure this out, and how does he even know it? So we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, but he defends his view by saying that all the other hedonistic views, except Jeremy Bentham's, well, he doesn't bring that here, see that the principle of utility puts some kinds of pleasures as more desirable and valuable than others. We're down here, looking here. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. So people who might advocate a crass hedonism are looking just at quantity. Okay, so if pleasure is good, more pleasure is better, and the most pleasure you can get would be the best situation. Now, most hedonistic philosophers will say you got to be careful, because the more pleasure you get, that's followed by higher pains, because it's kind of a trough thing. Okay, but Mill also adds to that some pleasures are just different kinds of pleasures. Okay, so his famous line is this: "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." There's my human being and pig picture. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And then he says this very telling line: "If the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides." So his answer to, well, what about people who disagree? His answer is, well, they haven't experienced both. That if you experience both, if you were Socrates experiencing your frustration at not being a wise person, you would still see that pleasure you get from knowing that is better than wallowing in the mud and whatnot. Now, this might be a little hard to believe for some of you, and yeah, I think you should be a little bit skeptical about this, but let's carry on the thought here and see what the picture of society that Mill is advocating for, what he thinks we need to have in order to actually answer these questions. So he says, "It is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus." Okay, now, do you believe that? Okay, You can't imagine somebody saying, well, I'll turn me into an animal if I can just sort of spend all my day wallowing in the mud and having sex. Yeah, that's the best life for me. Okay? Now, Mill is claiming there nobody would say that seriously. Or if they would, it's because they haven't felt the other pleasures. Do you agree with him? Okay? So people who would pick TV and beer over the pleasures of studying science and philosophy is because they haven't tried to be a philosopher. Now we're starting to beggar belief, aren't we? Of the two pleasures, Mill says, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, so if we take a poll and everybody who's experienced philosophy and drinking beer all day picks philosophy, and they don't feel like, well, I've got to tell you that. Okay, remember in the Gorgias, there was a Polus complained that Gorgias is only giving you the answers because he's ashamed of himself. So that would be an example of a moral obligation to prefer it. Okay, but if we have this kind of situation, then Mill says that is the more desirable pleasure. And people who haven't experienced both would be forced to admit that. If one of the two is by those who are competently acquainted with both placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality, so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. So Socrates has to be right confronting the Athenians because he's experienced philosophy and the other pleasures, and he now is really telling them this one is better. That didn't go over too well. From this verdict of the only competent judges, I apprehend there can be no appeal. So the logic seems pretty strong here, but the conclusion seems, again, unbelievable. Okay, you should be skeptical about this. Okay, let's push this a little bit further. What means are there, Mill would say, defending himself, which is the acutest of two pains or the intensest of two pleasurable sensations, except the general suffrage, he means people feeling it, of those who are familiar with both. So another word for suffrage is voting. So we simply have to have everybody feel these pleasures and then tell us, voting, which one is better. Neither pains nor pleasures are homogeneous, and pain is always heterogeneous with pleasure. What is there to decide whether a particular pleasure is worth purchasing at the cost of a particular pain, except the feelings and judgment of the experienced? Has Mill got us? Is his logic unassailable here? When, therefore, those feelings and judgment declare the pleasures derived from the higher faculties to be preferable in kind, apart from the question of intensity, so it's saying that this one's better than that, even if this one is a stronger feeling, to those of which the animal nature, disjoined from the higher faculties, is susceptible, they are entitled on this subject to the same regard. So, first question, I've got another one coming up. Maybe Mill just can't imagine a society of human beings that spurns the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge, preferring pornography, TV, beer, and Cheetos, and looking at our cell phones. Okay, is that the reason why we're doing all those things in our society? Because we haven't studied it, we haven't studied philosophy yet, and it hasn't bitten us? Or would a lot of those people say, well, I tried it, and no, pornography is much better? Something to think about. If enough of us in society have these experiences, things will shake out in favor of the higher pleasures. That's Mill's position, and that's what he believes would be progress. So progress is to get a society where everybody can, without force, feel and try everything. And then everybody will vote with their feet. And he also thinks, though, I think, deep down, that things like science and philosophy are going to win. Okay? Maybe he's just wrong about this. Maybe the pleasures of TV and beer are better. Okay, it seems that his procedure has at least opened up to that conclusion. He might be trying to sneak something in. So how do we get as many people as possible to experience as many pleasures as possible? Well, the answer to this is eliminate all situations where people are made to think and do things as a result of external force. And the two that he picks would be legislation and the tyranny of popular opinion. So basically, that's what On Liberty is trying to argue for, trying to find, the situations where we would be the freest. What would be the only legitimate reason to stop somebody from doing something? And Mill's answer to this is his famous harm principle. If it's going to harm somebody, you can't try that. But as long as it's not going to harm somebody, you should be free to try it. You should actually be encouraged to try it so that society can sort of come to this equilibrium about what's the best way to live. So he talks here, I'll go through this rather quickly. He says, the only reason that people choose lower pleasures would be because of necessity, temptation, or incapacity. And those things can all be fixed by fiddling with society in a way to give people the freedom so that they're not put into these situations. Okay, so we need a society that allows a maximal amount of experimentation so we can all determine, good Cartesians now, use our good sense with this method, determine and learn and enjoy the best pleasures there are for enjoying. It sounds really simple. It sounds really cool. It sounds like this is the way to go. At least if you're following the logic, you might be feeling that way. But part of you might be saying, well, wait a minute, can I really trust people? Should I let this happen? So here's a question. Is he being extremely optimistic about his belief that if we increase freedom in society, society will then get better, as he defines better, and not simply devolve into the lowest forms of human behavior? A lot of people think that that's what's going on in our society, where we have a lot of freedom. Okay, so we'll move on liberty in a moment. Next video, we'll start talking about some of the ways Mill defends his harm principle.